Hello, this is David Rovics with another episode of Discussions with David. Since the pandemic hit and made touring and performing impossible, I've taken to broadcasting interviews with people who I can't visit in person anymore. They're live streamed most weekdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and KBOO Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon. All these interviews also then go out in podcast form afterwards, which you can find if you look up This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform or just go to davidrovics.com. Today, we're spending the hour with artist, organizer, and author David Solnit in Berkeley, California. You'll find articles of his on platforms like Common Dreams, The Independent, and Fifth Estate magazine, and you'll see his giant puppets or giant puppets built according to a design someone got from David at protests around the world. He's been doing a lot of work as an artist organizer for 350.org in recent years, and he's perhaps best known for being a principal organizer of the Direct Action Network and the shutdown of the WTO meetings in Seattle in November 1999. Welcome to my little live stream show, David. That's my one paragraph intro. I don't know if it does any kind of a good job, but
thank you, David. What an honor to be with you, one of my favorite musicians.
Oh, thank you. David, what's been happening with the McDonald's workers there? I was looking around at various spots on the internet and coming across this physically distanced demo you were involved with organizing there in San Francisco.
In Oakland, I've been supporting a group of 33 McDonald's workers, and they just last month finished the longest fast food strike in United States history. They were out for 6 weeks. And during that entire period, the McDonald's franchise was forced to shut down. So, and they won a few of their demands. They got some short-term $2 an hour pay raise. So for a minute, they were making $17 an hour, which makes them high-paid fast food workers. On top of the fight for $15 they were getting, and they also got some quarantine pay, and part of what drove them on strike, and there's been a wave of strikes in the Bay Area and I know around the country, is that this multi-billion-dollar corporation couldn't shell out, both the corporation and the franchise owners couldn't spend a few tens or hundreds of dollars to buy appropriate PPE and to set up the mechanisms to protect the workers' health. So we had an outbreak of COVID. People were forced to work while sick, not given paid sick leave, a whole range of things that was a disaster. So I think we eventually had 13 of the 33 workers who tested positive for COVID, and I think it was 9 of their family members, including a 10-month baby, who all got COVID, and it was avoidable. And then that spread to 2 other McDonald's franchises in Berkeley and San Pablo. And so they both engaged in one-day strikes. And so, I heard about their first strike and went down there and said, what can I do to help? Brought some paint. And so we ended up taking over the parking lot and painting a street mural on the McDonald's parking lot that said, PPE for essential workers in giant red and gold letters, McDonald's colors. And then, so since that time, I've helped turn out community faith and community organization support and try to figure out how to use art to be creative and do socially distanced community support demonstrations and strikes, following the lead of the workers and backing up the Fight for 15 organizers.
I noticed one of the things you mentioned just maybe in passing on one of those posts about the action about specifically about painting the street was that you used washable paint. And a friend of mine was recently arrested for using a craft glue and a piece of paper to post a quote of of this colonizer, an Australian named Lachlan Macquarie. He posted a Lachlan Macquarie quote on the Lachlan Macquarie statue, and and in very easily washable, glue, the kind of glue that's water soluble, right? And he got arrested for it, which led me to wonder, like, have you actually been arrested for using water soluble paint on?
No, I haven't. And I talk to people around the country who have done street murals, and it's so situational. It has to do with what your local authorities are like, your cops, what your relationship, who you are, how many of you there are, what the context is. So, in a lot of Bay Area cities, San Francisco, Richmond, Oakland, we've done it repeatedly. And then, and there's been sort of a new wave of really stunningly beautiful and powerful Black Lives Matter street murals that have gotten, some of them very simple, just big block letters taking over whole streets. And those have mostly been done in permanent house paint that, if it's not messed with, can last a year if they don't power wash it off. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are stunning, where they'll divide up, they'll do the letter outlines, and then a different artist will do each letter. But I've been helping some of the Black-led groups in the Bay Area just on the logistics of doing those murals. We've done them in Richmond and Oakland and Berkeley High School.
And there's something, with so much of your artistic work at protests over the decades, I think there's something that reminds me of it, or in either direction, with these murals, because of the way that they take up space, and that whole phenomenon of taking over a space in terms of having a sort of a protest or an action, and how that can be so evocative in so many ways and have such an impact. The giant letters, giant puppets, and I think from a musical perspective, like, I love how in Europe they have sound trucks at all the demos. Mm-hmm. There's a big sound truck, and they take up a lot of sonic space as well. No,
I've been organizing since I was in high school in Portland. Metropolitan Learning Center, shout out.
Wait, you went to high school in Portland, Oregon? I
did, but after organizing in a range of direct action movements for almost a couple decades, I realized that we needed new ways of expressing ourselves and communicating. So I started to reach out to artists and performers and get them to help shape our demonstrations, and that was about 30 years ago. And so I actually, coming from an organizing perspective, I believe that our attempts to change the world are battles between different narratives or stories, and that for us to win, for us to shift the consciousness of our folks and help them rise, we have to become powerful storytellers, and that the people who have those skills are artists and musicians and theater people and dancers and crafters, and that and those people need to step up, and we need to make space for them to help lead, because they have the ability to tell the most powerful stories. So that's been sort of my last 20 years, has been experimenting with how can we use art. And I'm a lifelong construction worker and carpenter, so I'm good at the mechanics of making visual art. I'm very amusical, so I've tried to step up and bring in music, but at the end of the day, all we really have to tell our stories and to change the world are our voices, our bodies, and the things that we make with our hands. And so I've had some great collaborations with musicians. When we did a mass mobilization in San Francisco called Rise for Climate 2 years ago, we took over 5 city blocks. These are like 4 to 6 lane wide city blocks in front of City Hall, got 50 different community organizations to paint murals of their solutions to injustice and climate change, and had indigenous-led Society of Fearless Grandmothers help block the streets and chill out the cops. And then we painted the streets in 50 different teams and filled the background with natural clay, or sort of a red clay paint from the Sierra foothills. And during that whole time, we worked with teams of musicians who led songs. And so that was a real high point where we actually had coordinated singing, group singing, and mass transformation of 5 city blocks in the center of town into a giant street mural of our solutions. So yeah, I'm very excited to try and poke around and see what we can do with that. Just past the 20-year anniversary of the Seattle WTO shutdown, which was a big experiment in using arts organizing, and I like to brag that were it not for using the arts, we would not have been able to shut it down and scuttle their plans for a minute.
And how is that? How would you say that the arts was so central in shutting it down? I mean, in terms of the organizing of the meetings, in terms of all the road shows and all the different artists, and all the organizing that involved art prior to the WTO meetings or at the WTO protests themselves?
I think both. I mean, I was working with the Direct Action Network, and our core was a network of street theater collectives, sort of popular movement oriented anti-authoritarians, mostly young folks. And we had been experimenting for a few years with how can we use puppetry and street theater and performance. So we took everything we knew and we threw it at the WTO when it was announced they were going to come to Seattle. Initially, they were going to come to San Diego in my state. And so we're like, hey, we can't let this pass. But yeah, so we used the arts throughout. In 1999, no one knew what the WTO was. And if you started to talk to them, their eyes would glaze over like a college economics lecture. So we put together a street theater performance that broke it down using song and puppets, and actually 2 people who traveled up and down the Western US with us, Chi Abad, who was she had been a sweatshop worker in Saipan and tried to organize and had her life threatened and had to flee. So she talked about how corporate globalization and corporate capitalism impacted, her and her community. And then David Reed was a locked out steel worker with the Steelworkers Union at Kaiser Aluminum in Spokane, and they had been locked out of their work by what's his name, Charles Hurwitz, who was a junk bond crook who bought out both Pacific Lumber, making enemies of the environmental justice movements, and Kaiser Aluminum, and tried to take away the retirement and wage benefits of the steelworkers. So they would be part of our performance and actually tell their real life stories about how corporate globalization impacted our day-to-day lives. So that traveled up and down the West Coast. We built alliances by doing art builds in union halls, like in Spokane, with community groups. And then we did a series of neighborhood processions in Capitol Hill, Rainier Valley, the U District in Seattle, to try and set a festive tone that would entice people to come out into the streets. And we did 3 different community sort of procession parades in the lead up to it, and then just used art throughout. And then in the streets, the fact that we had beautiful art contrasted with the Darth Vader cops, I think really helped us hold our space, that we had songs and dance and music going throughout while we were also standing up to rubber bullets, tear gas, and police assaults. So I think I could say that we wouldn't have shut down what aspired to be the world's most powerful institution had we not had that. And our direct action, the streets, sort of bolstered the poorer countries who were being pushed from social movements in their own countries like Brazil and India to stand up to the US and scuttle the talks. And their plan A for running the world didn't work. So we're on plan B's and C's now.
And I mean, it's one of the things that has always struck me about the work you do specifically, David, is, I mean, you're doing this wonderful public art with the puppets and and big. It's, I mean, you're merging art and organizing in a particular way with the actions that you do, involving so many other people to put together sort of these public events that are both sort of artistic performances as well as protests. Or, I mean, it can vary what they are depending on the situation, but it strikes me that at some point in your life you might have decided, okay, I'm not going to try to do art in the context of events that somebody else is organizing, but I'm just going to organize events that are also artistic events as well as protests or civil disobedience. Or like, was there a moment where you decided you were just going to do all of it at the same time instead of just specialize? You know what I'm saying?
I mean, when I was young, I was drawn towards the arts and wanted to be an artist, but I also, saw the world was messed up as a young person. We thought we were on the verge of nuclear war under Reagan. The U.S. was beginning to wage wars on people's movements in Latin America, and stuff was messed up domestically. So I was like, and the art I was studying was fine arts, which I was really drawn to. But I was like, okay, who's it going to help if I get a painting in a gallery, and if I'm successful, someone with a bunch of cash will hang it over their couch? So, I sort of dropped that and have done carpentry and construction to pay my bills for most of my life. But then after 15 years of organizing, that's where I realized it's like, we actually need different ways of communicating and resisting. And so I started as I came up in the mass anti-nuclear movement that successfully stopped the nuclear power industry, which under Nixon had a plan for 1,000 nuclear power plants across the United States. And, starting at the height of the anti-nuclear power movement in the late 70s and early 80s, they were forced to stop at 100. And since that time have shut down about towards half of those. But I started to recruit my friends who had learned how to do street theater, with Heart of the Beast in Minneapolis and musicians. And then at a certain point, it's like, well, I want to do that part too. But so I come at art from an organizer's perspective. And, I think there's a type of art that advances the struggles of social movements. So when I do art with the McDonald's workers, I actually talk to them about what are your demands, what are your strategies, and I make sure that the art serves their struggle. And it's not so much it's a personal expression within that framework, there's a lot of space for creativity. But, as an artist serving a struggle or a movement, it should be determined by what fits into the strategy and the message of those groups. And and it's fun. I mean, I've been organizing for 40 years, and the last 20 of it have been a lot of art and culture, and I think that actually feeds us and keeps us going, and it's the best way to draw a lot of people into social movements, and make them rich, and also, I mean, I was watching a film called Rebel Music about the history of political music in Ireland. And, my question to you, David, is like, why don't you just write short essays instead of writing songs?
Sure, right. I mean, I do write short essays, and that can be a powerful form of expression. But songs are, yeah. Actually, when I started writing essays in a way that people started actually reading them and saying, "Wow, you're a great writer," it was because I started approaching them like songwriting, and but without ever telling anybody, like in the essay itself. I mean, it's not a secret, but I think the best essay writers are actually looking at their essay writing as artists. Like, I mean, you can tell, like people like Robert Fisk or John Ross or any number of others. They're clearly poets, whether they admit it or not. In some cases, they are poets, but I didn't realize that you were radicalized by the anti-nuclear movement. That was my story when I was 12 in 1979 as well, after 3 Mile Island on the East Coast. But there was also in the context of the anti-nuclear movement at that time in New England, where I grew up, the bread and puppet theater was all over the place. So that was my earliest exposure to sort of some similar productions to some of the stuff that you've done. And I wonder, was the San Francisco mime troupe a big part of your life as a kid? Or
I mean, I grew up watching them. Every year they do a different show, and when I was part of Art and Revolution Collective, that sort of street theater collective we formed in the 90s that fed into the WTO shutdown. They would collaborate with us and help us do May Day celebrations in Dolores Park. But I mean, I came out of the anti-nuclear movement, but simultaneously also came out of the punk scene, which was
that was very much coinciding in the late 70s.
Very vibrant in Portland with the Wipers and Poison Idea and all these old bands. But so that was actually a cultural rebellion, which I think there was. I learned a lot about how to create community and spaces for people to remake themselves, but also I think a lot of mistakes about how to get stuck in self-marginalization to where you can't effectively move your people.
To some extent, that's kind of that's definitely a part of the punk scene where people dress in a uniform and speak in a certain kind of lingo, and kind of it becomes a self-marginalized kind of thing. But the work you do with art is communicates on a much broader level. Is that? I
mean, that's the goal. I mean, you must feel that with songs, is that there's no guarantee that using art actually reaches people and moves people. That the goal is to figure out how to use it in a way that breaks across all the different barriers and actually reach people in the heart, the gut. I mean,
and telling a story is so much key to that, isn't it?
Telling a good story, I mean, thinking about what your narrative is, your lived narrative, not necessarily, and then trying to make the art sort of amplify that narrative in different ways. I mean, we've been doing that with the teachers' unions. My wife is a school teacher, and they just won a contract for their teachers' union last year, and they did a year-long campaign of sort of figuring out what the opponent's story was and what some of the negative popular narratives about public educators are, countering that with their personal stories. And then they spent a year basically telling their stories, both personal stories in front of school boards, street murals, screen printing, all kinds of stuff. And that the fact that they had thought in terms of narrative struggle is what won them their contract. Similarly, the Oakland teacher strike, put art at the center of it, and not just put art, but actually had the art really serve their stories, their narrative, and their messages, and it was participatory and so forth.
David, I'm wondering, there's been quite a lot going on in the Bay Area and all over the country in the past couple of months, especially since the killing of George Floyd. And but then it's also at different points and different places, it's often also reminiscent of other movements that have happened in the recent past, and in other ways it seems new. But I wonder what it seems like being in the Bay Area, having already lived through recent events like the movement that really kind of sprang up all over the country after the killing of Michael Brown in Missouri, and after the killing of Oscar Grant in Oakland, that also gave rise to a big movement, especially around the Bay Area. And I'm just wondering what your impressions are of what's going on now on the ground, to whatever extent you've been on the ground.
I mean, I've been humbly providing art support when asked to, so painting banners, signs, screen printing, helping with street murals, but otherwise just observing. And I think it's phenomenal in that this is an uprising in a longer term Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly since killing Michael Brown, the Black Lives Matter, Black Led movement has become very sophisticated, built infrastructure to the point where, we're not just doing protests, but people are, in many parts of the country, the demonstrations may not be as frequent, but they're actually, because they've built up relationships in the community and infrastructure, they can actually start defunding police departments and shifting the resources to where they're needed in the community. So, I'm incredibly hopeful about it and deeply impressed, and, trying to be of use where I can.
There's a lot more public conversation in mainstream media about defunding the police than I've certainly ever heard in my lifetime.
And also a real visionary politics that's not just oppositional, but that has, Movement for Black Lives has very articulated, sophisticated analysis of like, here's where we're going. Doesn't that, that's the juice, the visionary stuff we need to, I think that, which is so needed when you're opposing, horrifying violence and white supremacy, to actually have, what in the civil rights movement they call the blessed community, that actually a positive vision of where we're headed, and that actually life could be a lot better.
What's been happening as far as I know that you have a poster in the background that was one of the options to hang, but about the around canceling rent and rent strikes, and I know San Francisco area has been pretty central to a lot of that organizing that's been going on.
I haven't been in the trenches on the organizing. I've done, I'm a screen printer, so I've screen printed a lot of posters for car caravans, trying to keep people in their houses. But, I don't know what is up like where you are, but, so many people are an eviction or a rent check away from being on the streets. And there's a lot more people on the streets. I was just in San Francisco the other day, and there's, yeah. So
I'd say, as many people as were on the streets before the pandemic, I'd say there's like 3 or 4 times as many people on the streets now. Yeah.
So I know we've had some holding off on evictions in San Francisco and some of the East Bay cities, but it's not enough. And, and people are rightfully pushing for cancellation of rent, so that, if they get a pause on it, it doesn't accrue, so that then in 2 months after you've lost your job, you don't have to pay the last 3 months rent. As we're watching trillions of dollars get handed out to corporations.
There's quite a few of the people, quite a few folks who are involved with the nightly protests downtown Portland are watching right now. And I just wonder, just knowing that there's a bunch of kids with the Youth Liberation Front who are watching this interview, do you have any particular thoughts or insights or artistic advice or anything else that you might want to say to members of the Youth Liberation Front?
Most of what I've learned in the last 40 years, I was part of a youth movement that did a lot of innovation, and I think actually taught older movements a lot of things, and that was the Seattle WTO shutdown was a lot of mostly younger organizers innovating and figuring out new stuff. So I think it's good to learn from folks behind, but also, I've been watching and learning from what people are doing in the streets of Portland. So super grateful for that. And then, personally, I've kept myself going by finding forms of struggle that feed me and keep my spirit strong. And
did you know leaf blowers had so many practical applications?
I did not, though. I do have friends who do friendly pest control for agriculture, and they use them to sample what kinds of pests are in fields. They actually reverse the engine so that it can suck air in, and then they go to farms and sample what pests that might destroy crops are there, and then figure out what other pests other bugs they can release. It's called the bug farm in Southern California. So they actually use a leaf blower with the blowing mechanism reversed, so they can the really leaf suckers, but they're bug suckers. But no, so
fantastic. So there are other practical applications. I only just hated them entirely until just recently, and now I love them. Yeah.
Has anyone used industrial fans? That's starting to think about that.
That's
they make
a lot
fans
harder to transport, probably.
You'd have to have a power source and put them on a cart, but you can actually, blow 100 times as much air as a leaf blower.
And before we went on air, we were talking about different police departments in different parts of the country and the world. And one of the things that's notable about the San Francisco Police Department, and pretty much every European police department I've ever encountered personally, is that if there's people marching in the streets, they just escort the march and they never attack people for marching in the streets. But they might attack people for all sorts of other things, like for being black, for example, or for any number of other crimes. But the crime of a bunch of protesters marching in the street doesn't warrant being attacked and gassed and attacked with LRAD weapons and all kinds of stuff. And that's been around the country. It seems like in the past few months, what's a really common theme is whether or not the media reports it this way or not, is people are just taking to the streets, the most basic form of civil disobedience that I know of, and being violently attacked, and they're being declared riots just because they're in the streets. I wonder, I don't know, that's not a question, but do you have any reflections on that? And I suppose that's you were wondering why things escalated to the point they have in Portland, and I suspect that's a big part of it.
I mean, I've been in Portland and witnessed how much horrible the cops are in Portland than I think Seattle, San Francisco, I think LA might they're bigger in LA, and they're also quite horrible there. But I always just wondered, why does Portland have such a intolerant, violent police culture, worse than other cities? But and then I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and been in the streets of San Francisco since I was 15 or 16. And one thing that's I've watched, when I was young, if you stepped off the sidewalk, you'd end up face down in the street in handcuffs. I have stitches in my head from cops, cracking down on demonstrations. But one thing that was amazing was watching, sort of a concerted effort after the San Francisco police, raided gay bars and beat the shit out of people, almost killed Dolores Huerta. I was next to her, watching her get a club jabbed into her gut that ruptured her spleen and almost killed her. They just beat up so many communities that everyone got pissed off. And, and so there was sort of a three-front pushback going from the 80s till today, which was people sued them, and lawyers, the ACLU and the Lawyers Guild and individual lawyers pushed them back, sued them, rewrote their crowd control policy, and then watchdog them on that. And then community groups, flooded police commission hearings and pushed them on that. And then we in the streets also asserted our rights to march in the street without a permit and didn't back down. So that pushback from the later 80s into one is the right to march in the street and push back the police, and so just growing up watching it, I always wonder what it would take in different cities. I mean, not to pretend our cops are nice, but people often think, oh, it's, your cops are different than ours. Like, well, no, they were actually just as bad as Portland police, but people got together and pushed them back, and it's not abolition, but it's a little bit more breathing space so movements can be in the streets and do what we need to do. And also not that the San Francisco police is still horrible in terms of executing folks of color in our city. But for mass mobilizations in the street, we have a bit more breathing space than many other cities like New York, Portland, or LA.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that happens or doesn't happen. David, with the pandemic, and I mean, one of the things about art and is when it's a public thing and when it tends to bring people together and a sense of community and all that, and so much about that is about physical gatherings and physical spaces. And I wonder how's it been trying to adapt to the isolation of the past several months?
I mean, one thing that happened is we're about to do a mass demonstration and an art build for the Wet'suwet'en folks up in Indigenous folks in Canada who are fighting a pipeline. And that happened just as the pandemic was hitting. And so we canceled the art build, but I got together with Idle No More, Indigenous women's led group here in the Bay Area. And we figured out, okay, we can't do a physical art build, but what can we do? So we did what we call the virtual art build and experimented. And we asked each person to do one letter and then have it spell a word. And then we put it together, so so there's sacred, but we did a huge message. And the demonstration was to the so we did one in solidarity of the Wet'suwet'en, but then we also did a mass action. We had planned a mass action against the Army Corps of Engineers who are going to dredge the bay to allow tankers to bring oil from tar sands to the bay. And so we did a giant virtual banner, involved towards 100 people, and each making a letter, with some people with their families, taking a photograph, sending it in. Then we put it together as an online graphic in a video. We printed it out like these signs I'm holding, and we physically held it in front of the offices of the Army Corps. We projected on their buildings at night. So we really tried to innovate, and then created a template about how to do that. And then also in the months afterwards, experimented a lot with virtual choirs where we would have a musician lay down a track, people would listen to it and then sing along and record themselves, and we put it together. You've seen a lot of high school choirs do that, but we were doing it for songs with a message like Stop the Money Pipeline.
Great.
So I think there's a lot people can do, in the space. And then also, as there's been a little bit more breathing space, like with the McDonald's demonstrations, we did one demonstration when a lot of the McDonald's workers were self-quarantining because they had been exposed to folks with COVID. So we did cardboard cutouts of the 33 workers and got one volunteer to hold each one. And we put chalk markers and took over their parking lot. So everybody was, 8 feet apart, holding a virtual representation of one of the workers who couldn't be there at that time. Some of the workers were there, but so trying to find ways that we can be socially distanced, safe, and keep going.
David, having been involved with movements that talked a lot about government loans and debts and austerity measures imposed by organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And then we're in a situation now where not only are many countries at risk of defaulting on their sovereign debts once again, but the countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and so many other countries are spending just unbelievable amounts of money on all sorts of things that they said there was no money for before, and I wonder if has that been to me, it was just I was kind of as inept as the response to this whole crisis has been by the United States government. Just that initial $3 trillion expenditure and receiving checks in the mail and all that. I mean, that was I wasn't even expecting the government to be able to mount that kind of response. Although in retrospect, it seems like, of course, they had to do that. But I don't know. Did that bring about any particular thoughts for you?
I mean, one of the formations I have the honor of getting to do some art with is the Poor People's Campaign, and I feel like they do a lot of innovative thinking about how to think about things. And one of the things that they're calling for now is a jubilee, and that's the idea of a jubilee is something that throughout history, when people have been burdened with debt, there's a tradition of having a jubilee where all debts are forgiven or relieved, and there's a lot of brilliant organizing of the debt strike, where people have tried to organize students to not pay their debt, or done sort of symbolic fundraisers, realizing that debts then become commodities that get packaged and sold and resold. So I'm excited, and that's one of the ways they squeeze a lot of wealth out of our communities is by, as our wages and, as they take more and more of what we create with our hands and our bodies and our voices, they give us credit, and then we go into debt to go to school, to buy the things we need, to have a place to live, to get healthcare. So that's one thing I'm inspired right now, is that the Poor People's Campaign is calling for a jubilee, for a relief of all debt. And as debtors, we have a lot of power in that. It's a construct. There's nobody actually is going to be harmed if nobody ever pays their debts. And that throughout most of history, the idea of making money on money has been deeply unethical in most religious and human traditions. It's usury. I mean, those were the people Jesus turned over the table and kicked out of the temple. So we need to be, as Reverend Barber said, we need to be like Jesus, and kick the predatory debt collectors out.
Yeah, Reverend Barber keeps on saying, I mean, he just keeps on getting better, it seems to me, like over the past couple months. I mean, he's always been great, but it's like the message that he's talking about is now getting picked up by all kinds of more circles where you weren't hearing these things being talked about. Like, I mean, one of the things that the head of the AME church in Seattle was recently saying is you can't, if Black Lives Matter, then you have to have housing has to be affordable for the average Black family. And like here in Portland, a 2-bedroom apartment is not affordable by the average Black family in the United States. But in terms of with the pandemic and the origins of it, and the relationship there with climate change, and then with governments taking so much action to try to contain the pandemic because they're maybe concerned about their lives of their citizens, but also concerned about their economies. And it's all this all kinds of action that needs to be taken in a big way really quickly. And a lot of governments have been doing it, and it's been on the minds of a lot of climate change people involved with trying to prevent climate chaos and turn this whole thing around before we end life as we know it on the planet. People are making this observation that this kind of government expenditure and these kinds of big actions can be made. It's possible. And then how these kinds of things could be done to actually save the species, save the life on Earth, as well as contain a pandemic. And I wonder if you've been having any particular thoughts, and artistic or otherwise, on that subject.
I mean, as many folks have pointed out, that we're at a a psychic break or a rupture in our history and in our story. So there's a huge opening to take that rupture and, as Arundhati Roy says, make it a portal to something better. So I think there's a huge chance, and then everything that we've said about not just Trump, but the sort of system of corporate capitalism has sort of proven itself that it's pathologically does not care at all about people or the planet, just in squeezing wealth out for a few folks. So yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity. We just saw the cancellation of or significant delay of 3 major pipelines, fossil fuel projects. So there's actually some, and the pandemic has forced people to stop moving around the planet and using so much fossil fuels. So I think there's, and the poster that's over my head is Just Recovery. It's sort of one of the frameworks in the U.S. There's a parallel group called People's Bailout, but the idea is, let's actually go on the offense and take the initiative in this moment and demand that we're going to have not just a recovery, but a just recovery, and we're going to remake things so that it works for working people and communities. People get what they need, and part of that is resilience, that we're going to actually remake things so that we don't need to consume fossil fuels and we can transition off of it. We just one of our 5 Bay Area oil refineries that poison our kids and pollute our environment just shut down from the pandemic because the demand went down.
The Chevron refinery?
No, it's the Marathon one in Martinez. And as one of our local organizers who's been trying to envision transitioning from, shutting down all the refineries, but doing it in an organized way in which the workers actually get taken care of. So you don't end up going toe to toe with the people who have a job and pay their bills from those. Right now it's an unplanned no transition. So it means the workers get screwed. But if the vision is to have a just transition so that we actually, use the resources that the fossil fuel industry has concentrated and take care of working folks who are working in destructive industries, as we transition to the billions of potential jobs to get the energy sources and dramatic reduction in energy consumption and public transit and affordable housing with, renewable resources that we need. So there's a international network calling for a just transition, and they have 5 principles, and one of them is resilience, which means let's get off fossil fuels, use this moment, and then shift dramatically to a just transition to all the technologies and dramatic conservation that we know is possible.
And 350 is involved with that coalition as well?
They are, yeah. And there's a bunch of climate groups that utilize some of the 350 resources, like the Pacific Climate Warriors, who are indigenous folks in the Pacific Islands who are fighting hard to save their islands from going underwater and sort of setting a model for the rest of us.
And have you been out there doing any work in the Pacific Islands? Because you were doing quite a lot of traveling before the pandemic hit, right? I mean, for years now, you've been doing a lot of traveling with setting up trainings and puppet making workshops and all sorts of stuff.
I mostly just around the U.S., occasionally elsewhere, but I try not to fly around.
But traveling around the U.S., it's a big country, so you can do a lot of traveling around the U.S.
Yeah. No, I do a lot of that. And then, I've also been trying to figure out how we can share skills and create resources that people can use elsewhere. So I've created work with a lot of artists to create art for a Green New Deal that people can download and use and color in and innovate and make their own, and tips on how to turn it into different forms, that type of stuff.
Was that on the web? Some of that stuff?
Some of it from I'm actually not working with 350 anymore. I'm just transitioning out to try and do more, be able to do more work with impacted working class communities. But a lot of that arts resources are up at art.350.org.
Mm-hmm. And what plans did you have before the pandemic hit that were impacted in your personal life as an artist organizer?
I mean, the core of what I did a lot was making art together with people. I mean, art build is a central form of how I've created art with movements. So, that's been a big deal trying to figure out. And I'm just going back to where we're doing outdoor art builds, like with the McDonald's workers, we get them to come together, figure out what their messages are, the colors, and then creating art. We just did for Strike for Black Lives. The workers at the 6 weeks struck McDonald's on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland. They had gone back to work, but for that day they did a walkout, shut it down. We took over the parking lot and we threw ladders up on the McDonald's and climbed on the roof and had 10 people up there and completely redecorated with giant strike, band, and dignidad, different banners. And so and that was all the art was created the day before in a big outdoor art build.
Wonderful.
So it seems like a key moment to me to, the folks who are getting impacted, especially during the pandemic, are a lot of the frontline workers and low wage workers that can't afford not to work. And there's a huge wave of wildcat strikes all over the country. A lot of them non-unionized workers, like I just did art for some of the Amazon workers in the Bay Area. And these folks are fighting to not get to have very basic protections so they don't get exposed to COVID and don't bring it home to their families. My wife's a teacher. Their teachers unions are fighting for the same thing. So it seems like a critical moment to have the backs of those workers and, and hopefully to weave all this stuff together into, funneling people power. And, the national teachers unions are getting ready to go on strike if they need to. They just canceled school in Chicago, and they did it because the union had scheduled a strike vote, and so it was the threat of the strike that actually got the city authorities to do the right thing. So I'm hopeful that we can weave together, some of the visionary politics of movement for Black Lives together with, all the workers who are rising up around a lot of this very similar issues, and then some of the visionary politics of the climate justice movement to transition to ways of running our society that in which Black lives matter and in which the earth is taken care of.
It's the pandemic and the response to it is really exposing so many different fault lines in so many different ways. It's really really hard to kind of take it all in as far as and the interconnected nature of so many of these things that are being exposed in terms of just the essential workers and who are the essential workers and who's in the overcrowded housing and just on and mass incarceration and who's getting COVID in the slaughterhouses and the prisons. I mean, it's and then now here we are at in this first week of no more unemployment money coming from the federal government for tens of millions of people. And then there's so many other people who tried to apply and never even have been able to get through to that's like me. I've been trying for months and I never have gotten anything but a busy signal. Or once I got, they picked up the phone and then they hung up on me. I mean, it was not a person; it was just the answering machine, But then at the end of the message, he got disconnected, and that's the closest I've gotten to talking to anybody in the state of Oregon. And that's and I don't have the problem of like my not being able to pay for my phone plan, because I hear about other people who are unemployed who they can't even they get their phone cut off because they can't pay for that, and then they can't even call the the employment department. It's very surreal and a horrible situation for so many people right now. But
yeah, it's grim.
And yeah, I'd never. I mean, I know that asking anybody to make any kind of a prediction is a ridiculous thing to do. But any predictions over how things are going to go in this country over the next few weeks and months? Is there going to be an election in November?
I mean, I guess the part I look to is, what can I do in my community to try and fight and win for certain things? We just saw by organizing, people power, the Chicago Teachers Union was able to cancel the schools, so somehow we have to figure out how to do that around all the things that our communities need, and hopefully be visionary and find ways how can weave together. I thought the strike for Black Lives was significant in terms of bringing together the movement for Black Lives and parts of the labor movement, and including the unorganized workers or the self-organized workers that don't have a formal union. So
I think
that's
about
what I'm looking to, and and the renters and the debtors and the we all have a lot of leverage,
right?
And then also, and the positive side is, the people's ability to self-organize and take care of each other is amazing. So the scale of mutual aid is phenomenal. We just need to, either shift the priorities of the dominant structures or replace them and get our hands on those resources so that we can actually bolster up our mutual aid networks to have the trillions of dollars that the corporations are pocketing.
It seems like, in a way, it's a really hopeful moment, because things like, if you say, you want to organize a rent strike, and 20% of the people are already not able to pay rent, so they're quite readily maybe more inclined to join a rent strike since they can't pay anyway. Like it's a powerful moment for organizing, potentially.
Yeah.
But you feel, a lot of very intelligent people are very concerned about the imminent approach of a overtly fascist state in the U.S. And are you worried about that eventuality? Or are you feeling more hopeful about the possibilities?
I'm worried about what we already have, and and the battle to shift things. I think the majority of which is the power of social movements. There's an election too, which is significant, but I think most of the shift is people organizing into social movements and being more organized than our opponents. And I'm paying attention, figuring out what I can do, and trying to keep the spirits of those around me and the organizations I work with up, and and using art and culture throughout.
I don't usually ever ask people that question, like, are you feeling hopeful? But you're like the most optimistic person I know, so I had to ask, because if you're not feeling optimistic, I don't know what I would do.
We're one of the folks I has been a mentor is George Lakey, who came out of the a white conspirator with the civil rights movement, but he's noted that a lot of the positive changes in the 1930s and the 1960s came out of similar moments when there was huge polarization, emergent KKK, Nazi, and fascist movements, and that he says it's sort of like if you want to reshape metal, it has to get hot, and then you can reform it. So right now the metal is really hot. And, if we tell a better story, use our art and culture, and are more organized than, the crumbling corporate capitalist empire, then we can reshape that metal into something that serves our communities, and in which Black Lives Matter and the earth matters. But then if we're disorganized, if we don't figure out how to organize our folks, and particularly those of us who are white, figuring out how do we organize other white folks so they don't end up being shock troops against their own interests for corporate capitalism. Then the metal will get shaped into something very badly, as it did. I had half my family is Jewish, and the Germany was in a similar situation, and they actually lost to the Nazis. Whereas and looking at why they lost versus why Scandinavian social movements also had an emergent fascist or Nazi movement in Scandinavia. And they actually won because they had visionary politics, and they didn't engage in street battles with the fascists. They actually organized non-cooperation against the system around common popular visions. They won, and then the communists and small parts of the left engaged in street battles with the Nazis and scare the middle class, and and ended up losing badly. So to me, there's some good lessons there. And particularly, Portland's on the front line is like, well, why is Trump sending federal troops or federal police in there? It's obviously trying to provoke something that will scare a lot of the populace into supporting him, since there's no other reason to support him. So trying to find, I think there's a challenge for people to figure out how not to play to your opponent's narrative and how to dodge it and do something unpredictable. And I think that's happening a lot.
Very good. Very good. Yes. David, thanks so much for joining me on the little show here. And hopefully other people enjoyed it as much as I did, but that was great having you on.
Thank you for making songs and conversations and writing beautiful prose as well.
My pleasure. Hope to see you around, Dave.
Much love to all the folks in Portland. The whole world is watching you on live stream every night.
That's true.
Funny. It's like, okay, it looks like there's maybe, this many hundred people out there, and then there's for every one person in the street
watching.
There's probably 500 watching.
I know, for every one of those demos, like 200 people, and then you see the Twitter views like 30,000.
Right. At some point, we're going to have to cut off all the live streams and say, okay, everybody watching other cities, go out into your streets and do it yourself.
Definitely. Yes.
All right. Thanks much.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
And thanks everybody for tuning into this conversation with David Solnit. You can find all of these discussions archived in various places, including on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovics in the Discussions with David playlist. You'll also find them all in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform, or just go to davidrovics.com. If you want to support my broadcasting efforts, you are most welcome to become a patron at patreon.com/davidrovics, where all these broadcasts are also available for anyone to download, along with some patron-only offerings as well. If you're in the Portland area, please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up to receive text notifications so you can be part of Portland emergency eviction response when the investment banks that own half of the city start trying to evict so many of our neighbors. If you want to help make my next album a multi-instrumental success, check out davidrovics.com/pandemic sessions. I'll be back online very shortly to perform at the Karlsøy Festival in Norway, more or less. And then tomorrow I'll be talking to artist, organizer, and university professor from Argentina via Massachusetts, Graciela Monteagudo. Remember, don't pay the rent. Don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.